I mean, I'm certain anyone who's a fan of 33 1/3 kind of has that wish list, that what if list in the back of their head, you know. If I was going to write one of these books, what album would I choose to write about? And I had my list, and to be honest, Donuts was never really on it. Like, I'll never forget the first time I heard it. I was back in Windsor. I was working at a paper and doing layout. It was like late on a Friday night, and I stepped out to get a coffee, and on my way back grabbed one of the Detroit alt weeklies. There was a front page story on this guy Dilla, and that's when I realized that he had passed. And despite being like a hip-hop fan for most of my life, like since 8 years old, I hadn't really paid attention to hip-hop for a while, so much so that I didn't know this J Dilla guy was the same person as the JD who made all the beats for Pharcyde and Tribe Called Quest and Common that I loved, you know, in the late 90s. So when I put that together, I realized, oh man, we have this album, this Donuts album they're talking about. We have it in the office. So I went to the arts office and grabbed our review copy, brought it back to my desk, put it on, and hated it. What am I listening to? It made no sense to me. There was no entry point for me for the songs. And the ones I did like right away were over in 90 seconds. And I don't even think I made it through the whole album on that first listen. I think I stopped 2/3 through. I didn't try it again until years later. I guess I always said I needed to catch up to where he was. But even as that album grew in my esteem, as it kind of moved up, you know, my hierarchy of favorite albums, it still wasn't really registering as something I would want to write about for 33 1/3. And I remember I was walking home from work one night. I was getting really frustrated at my inability to settle on a topic. I was ready to just abandon the whole thing, to be honest, when The New came on. And I started thinking, man, someone should write a 33 1/3 about donuts. Wait, I should write a 33 1/3 about donuts. In that early moment when I started, I mean, what fascinated me was kind of what fascinates everybody about the album. I mean, he was dying. He was facing head-on the one thing most people go through every day trying not to think about. But even with all of that weighing on him, he still had to make music. He couldn't stop. How many people are devoted enough to their craft to say that? Gotta be crazy or a genius? Probably both. There are so many people who work to keep Dilla's life and work relevant. They're also really protective of those things. My hope was that if those people believed my intentions were good, they'd be happy to help, which luckily has been the case. So I've been in touch with most people fans would expect me to have talked to. Everyone at Stone's Throw, Jeff Jank, Ethan Alpat, Peanut Butter Wolf, J-Rock, House Shoes. I've spoken with Ronnie Reese, who's a journalist who has written about Dilla probably more than anyone else. Dave Cooley, Dilla's recording engineer, as well as Jay Hodgson, who's a professor and recording engineer. He wrote a book called Understanding Records. He's a major fan of donuts and has been very helpful as I try to wrap my head around some of the mechanics on how you make dusty samples sound so good. I made my decision to write a proposal pretty late in the submission window, so there were many late nights, many early mornings, many pots of coffee, lots of distracted daydreaming at work, lots of frantic texts and phone calls to friends for proofreading or idea bouncing, that sort of thing. I certainly wouldn't recommend anyone wait as long as I did before starting to assemble your proposal, but it was undoubtedly one of the most fun things I've ever done, until the moment they said I could actually write the thing. I mean, I don't want to tip my hand too much here, but I think a lot of what's been written about donuts looks to decode whether or not it's an album by one man facing his mortality. While I do agree with that theory, ultimately I think it's kind of a shallow interpretation. In writing the proposal and listening to the album again and again and sitting with it, I found I was growing more and more curious about why the album sounds the way it does. It's easy to forget with all the myth-making and deathbed creation stories that surround the album. It's really freaking weird. I mean, musically, sonically, it is all over the place. And when you take it as, the end point of a career that spans 10 years and thousands of beats, it makes it even weirder. Like, how do you end up there? And if you want to try to tackle that, I mean, now you're looking at philosophy and psychology and literary theory, and you're looking at his frustrations with the major label models and his move to Los Angeles and his relationship with Stone's Throw and Madlib. So I mean, there's a lot more going on that album than the sort of binary is it or isn't it about death gives it credit for. It's deceptively complex. It's practically a given at this point, but I've been rereading Carl Wilson's book on Celine Dion and continue to marvel at the way he can braid so many lines of thought into one cohesive thread. James Wolk's book on Live at the Apollo by James Brown was fairly revelatory, as was Christopher Weingarten's book on Public Enemy, which was as much about the samples and the people who made the samples as the people who took the samples and made something new. Obviously, I found a lot of inspiration there. As a lifelong hip-hop fan, it somewhat shames me to admit, actually it kind of makes sense in its way. My first concert was Aerosmith at the Palace in Auburn Hills, Michigan. I wish I could say it was one of those life-changing moments when you see live music for the first time. Alas. One thing I do remember is that the opener was Jackal, who you may remember featured the frontman who brandished a gas-powered chainsaw, which he did that night. He brought it out on stage and gunned it rhythmically. I feel like that's a big problem with rock music anymore. There's just a really tragic lack of power tools in rock and roll performance anymore. I'd like to see that brought back. Despite my inability to walk past a record store without popping in and flipping through the bins, which I think has more to do with my love of collecting than my love of music, realities of economy and storage space prohibit me from listening to my music on vinyl. If you see me on the train or in the streets, I will be wearing headphones. MP3s just make the most sense for a Toronto Transit rider. Despite being an instrumental album, there are voices heard on Donuts, there are vocal samples, and there are sort of recurring motifs. If I had to pick one of them, it would probably be Joeski Love, who had a novelty hit in the 80s called Pee-wee's Dance, which was about Pee Wee Herman, this whole thing. And it's the sound of him going, huh? What? Which is probably a good summation of my early experience with Donuts. I love that sample because I feel like it operates on two levels. Like, on the one hand, it's the voice of the listener, like myself, who encounters the album and goes, what am I listening to? On the other hand, that what also feels like a challenge from Dilla to everyone who will come after him. Like, all right, here's what I got. What do you got? What? That sort of belief in one's own dopeness is practically the foundational bedrock of hip-hop. I love that sample because it's like, as sick as he was, his faith in himself was absolute, and that is beyond inspiring.